Welcome. Today we're going to speak about how science and technology can be harnessed to improve the health of some of the poorest people in the world. By the end of this session, you should be able to speak comfortably about the needs for drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines to address high-burden diseases that affect the poor in low and middle-income countries, the extent to which existing products meet those needs, the potential of science and technology to develop enhanced products to address high-burden and debilitating diseases, and some of the key constraints to investments in such products, as well as selected mechanisms to overcome these constraints and encourage the development and uptake of enhanced diagnostics, vaccines, and drugs. Let's begin with some vignettes. Juan lives in the highlands of Peru. Juan is being treated for tuberculosis at a local clinic. Juan has to take 4 drugs for 2 months and then 2 drugs for 4 months in order to cure his TB. But Juan is getting tired of taking so many pills for such a long time, and some days Juan does not take his tuberculosis drugs. Mei Ling is 4 years old and lives in the west of China. Like so many children in her region, Mei Ling is infected with hookworms. The community has a deworming program, and every 6 months, Mei Ling is given medicine to get rid of the worms. This medicine is generally safe and effective. However, it has to be given twice a year, and there's some indication that the hookworms are becoming resistant to it. David is 7 years old and lives in the eastern part of Kenya. He had a high fever and chills, and his mother took him to the local health clinic. The nurse examined David, decided he had malaria, and prescribed anti-malarial medicine. This was a new medicine, different from and more expensive than the one that used to be given, because that one doesn't work anymore in Kenya. This was the 3rd time in a year that David had malaria. Now let's explore, with the help of our students, some of the concepts brought up by these vignettes. Let's begin by looking at what ideal forms of drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines would be if we were to better, more effectively, more efficiently, more affordably address high-burden, communicable, and parasitic diseases. As we do so, let's keep in mind that many people who suffer from these diseases are poor. They often live in tropical or subtropical environments, and they often live in countries with weak health systems. So let me ask Emily, if I might, what would an ideal vaccine for tuberculosis look like?
Well, we would want the vaccine to be heat stable and only need 1 dose and offer very good protection against tuberculosis throughout your entire life.
And TB of one form or many forms?
Of every form.
Of every form. And Elizabeth, if I might, what would an ideal form of a diagnostic be for tuberculosis?
An ideal diagnostic would be minimally invasive, highly effective at detecting different forms of TB, and also be effective in detecting TB that might be hidden, like latent TB or TB in children.
Okay, and let me turn to Shaylin and say, Shaylin, we know that the standard course of therapy for drug-susceptible tuberculosis is 6 months. In a more ideal world, what would an ideal drug regimen for TB look like?
Yeah, it would be shorter than it is now, ideally maybe 1 pill. It would be cheap and affordable and have minimal side effects possibly, and it would also be heat stable.
And probably even confer lifelong immunity of some kind, etc. Indeed, it's important that diagnostics be specific, sensitive, easy to use, and non-invasive. Ideally, in fact, diagnostics could be done quickly by relatively untrained workers and would rapidly produce easy-to-read results. Of course, they would also, in the settings in which we want them to be used, be easy to transport, heat stable, inexpensive, not require refrigeration. And of course we could say, and we'll see in this graphic, very similar things about the ideal state of vaccines or the ideal state of drugs. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a world where some of the important health conditions affecting people, especially poor people in low and middle income countries, if we could have for them vaccines that were affordable, safe and effective, required few doses, conferred lifelong immunity, easy to transport and store and heat stable. Wouldn't it be wonderful as well as if we had drugs, as my students said, that were affordable, safe and effective, not easy for pathogens to become resistant to, required only small doses over a limited period, were easy to store and transport, were also heat stable. And we're thinking also, of course, about delivery devices. And there too, it would be wonderful if they were affordable, safe and effective, not invasive, easy to transport, store, and heat stable. For all of these, in a more ideal state, we would be looking at non-invasive, affordable, relatively easy to use by even relatively untrained health workers, produce very quick results that both the workers and the patients could understand, that they would be easy to transport, easy to store. By and large, for all of these, in a more ideal world, we'd love to see some similar characteristics. Now, let's talk, however, about the present state of affairs. First, it's important to understand that science and technology have been very important to addressing a range of diseases and communicable diseases. And if you look at the history of efforts, for example, to address smallpox or onchocerciasis, you'll see that for both of them, along the route of global efforts to address these diseases, there were important scientific and technical discoveries and developments that allowed these diseases to be more effectively and efficiently addressed, and in the case of smallpox, helped to enable smallpox to be eradicated. For smallpox, for example, the development of the bifurcated needle and freeze-dried vaccine was very important. For onchocerciasis, it was extremely important that they found that a drug that was used to treat parasitic infection in animals could in fact be used to treat or prevent onchocerciasis in humans. And yet, even in a world where science and technology have been so valuable, there's an enormous gap between the ideal state we'd like to see and where we are today in terms of a number of important diseases, especially diseases that affect primarily people in low and middle income countries. For tuberculosis, again, the standard course of therapy for drug-susceptible TB is 6 months long and requires a lot of pills to be taken for a long time. For malaria, there's an effective and efficient drug called artemisinin that's given in combination with other drugs in a manner that's called artemisinin combination therapy. And yet, there's already resistance developing to artemisinin combination therapy. There aren't very many new drugs under development, and we're constantly at risk of living in a world where the malaria parasite becomes more and more resistant to the drugs that we have, and we won't be able to treat malaria effectively. For the neglected tropical diseases, there are no vaccines, though people are working on them. And it's important, given the state of the drugs that we have, that people take them several times, for example, per year. And wouldn't it be wonderful instead if we had a safe and effective vaccine for some of these diseases, and if they didn't have to take these drugs every year, twice or 3 times a year, for example, for 10, 15, or 20 years to try to stop transmission of some of these neglected tropical diseases. It's also important to note that the need for more ideal drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, and delivery devices is also highlighted by the growing problem of drug resistance. Vaccines prevent disease and keep us from using antibiotics to which bacteria can become resistant. In addition, we have substantial problems already of resistance with tuberculosis, as I mentioned, and a growing problem of resistance with malaria as well. And we had historically substantial problems of resistance with malaria and the primary drugs that have been used traditionally to treat that malaria. There are also only a few drugs that are effective now against some diseases and growing resistance to those drugs. We're probably living in a world in which we urgently need to develop new drugs before some of the existing ones are really no longer effective. So we need to ask ourselves, therefore, what are the constraints to meeting our ideals for these products? And especially these products as they might meet the needs for better health of relatively poor people in low and middle income countries. So let's turn to our students and see what thoughtful suggestions they have on this. Emily, if I might, if you were the president of a major pharmaceutical company, what would be your main goal in life?
Making a lot of profit.
Okay, making a lot of profit. You would be paid by your shareholders to do what they call increased shareholder value by making a lot of profit. And let me ask you, Elizabeth, if this were your goal, then why would that maybe discourage you from investing in drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines that you might need, that the world might need, to address some of the health problems, especially of poor people in low and middle income countries?
Well, in order to make a lot of profit, I might decide to invest only in drugs that treat high income countries' conditions, especially conditions that might be chronic, so they'd be forced to take the drug continuously.
And indeed, what we see is a world in which there is a perception by many of the private developers and manufacturers of these products of a limited market in low and middle income countries for the goods that we would like to see. We can see a number of key constraints, in fact, this perception of the limited market, high costs of research and development, and the high opportunity cost. If a pharmaceutical company might require $800 million, for example, to invest in a vaccine to meet some of the health needs of poor people in poor countries, and they don't think there may be the money to pay for it at the cost they need to charge to recover their investment, they are not going to manufacture that or develop it. They're much more likely to say, with this kind of opportunity cost, let's invest in some of the drugs, for example, that Elizabeth has suggested. The development and production of vaccines is also quite complicated, and that itself has been a constraint to having more players in the vaccine market. And at the same time, we know that historically, though better now than before, many important national research institutions have actually paid relatively less attention to some of these diseases than they might. Now, in principle, we have to ask ourselves, are there measures that countries or the global community together could take to address some of these important constraints, to change the perceptions of the market and to make product developers, distributors, and sellers feel like there are real prospects that they can get their return on investment if they develop the drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, delivery devices that we need to improve the health, especially the health of poor people in some of these countries. So let's look at another graphic that talks about some of the ways that this might be done. Some of the measures that might be taken can be classified as either as pull and push mechanisms. There are a number of so-called push mechanisms that have to do with lowering the costs to potential developers of these products, either by providing direct financing, by financing clinical trials at the expense, for example, of the public or of national research institutions, or perhaps by offering tax credits for research and development, so that if Elizabeth's company is willing to invest in the development of a new product for onchocerciasis, a government or a set of governments might offer her tax credits that would lower to her the cost of that product development. At the same time, there's a number of interventions called pull interventions. These lower the costs up front, and these, as you can see by the darkening colors, actually try to incentivize you in the later stages of development. One can, for example, encourage countries to uptake more, to take and use more of a certain vaccine to help create the impression that there really is a larger market and there's money to pay for these vaccines if companies would develop them. One might offer prizes. I might say to Shaylin and other who runs a company and other similar companies, if you are able to develop a safe, effective, and affordable drug against X or Y, let's say even tuberculosis, we're willing to give you a prize as high as $50 million if you can do that in the next 3 or 4 years. Patents are worth a lot of money. And we might say to Emily, if your company can develop this, we might be willing to give you, or we would be willing to give you, a patent extension on one of the drugs from which you're now making good profit to help you offset the costs of developing this drug, for example, for which you believe there's not a sufficient market or sufficient money to pay for the drug. One can also give market assurances, promises, let's say, from some of the better off countries that they will help to pay for some of these products if they're developed. And also one might give tax credits for sales, for example, of vaccines. Now, related to push mechanisms, a number of global health actors, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the US government, and the Canadian government, has set up a program called Grand Challenges in Global Health. And as part of this program, what they're doing is offering grants for, but in a sense they're also prizes because people are proposing. They're issuing broad-based tenders and they're encouraging scientists throughout the world to try to engage in research and development that can help ultimately set the foundation for or lead to more affordable, effective, safe, etc., drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines like those that we're talking about. And this graphic gives you some examples of some of the grants that have been awarded historically by a number of these organizations in 4 areas. One was discover new ways to achieve healthy birth, growth, and development. Another is to develop technologies that allow assessment of multiple conditions and pathogens at the point of care. Some of you may have been reading, for example, about the hope that one could breathe on a piece of paper, and that piece of paper might light up in different colors and eventually say to us whether or not we have one or more health conditions. Create a full range of optimal bioavailable nutrients in a single stable plant species. Some of you will be familiar with efforts, for example, to develop rice that's rich in one micronutrient, or cassava or potatoes that are rich in others. And also efforts to improve delivery devices by, for example, developing needle-free delivery systems. And this is a very, very small sample of a large number of awards that have been given in the last decade or so to scientists throughout the world to try to encourage them to engage in the research and development that might be needed to improve the products that we have available. Now, it's also important to understand that global actors beginning in 1997 created a new kind of organization called Public-Private Partnerships for Health, or Product Development Partnerships, in the hopes that these organizations could help also to overcome some of these market imperfections, in the hopes that these organizations, which have largely been funded by some private philanthropies and some high-income country governments, in the hopes that they could broker arrangements between the public sector, research institutions, the private sector, and other important actors to set a foundation for the more rapid development of some of these drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines than would otherwise be possible. The first of these product development partnerships was created in 1997 and is called the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative. But today we see there's a large number of such partnerships, and they include the TB Alliance, whose goal is to enable the development of more effective, efficient drugs for tuberculosis, the Medicines for Malaria venture, whose goal is to enable the development of a safe and effective vaccine for malaria, ERIS, whose goal is to encourage the development of a safe and effective vaccine that could hopefully prevent as many forms of tuberculosis as possible, and the Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics, which is largely focused on the development of new diagnostics like those we discussed that would be safe, effective, efficient, and less invasive, produce more rapid results at the point of care than some of the diagnostics that are available now. Now, there have been some progress as a result of the efforts of these public-private partnerships and product development partnerships, but in some respects it's still early in their life cycle. And it's going to be very important over the next 5 to 10 years to see the extent to which they're able to encourage and enable the development of the products that are needed. Now, it's also important to understand that the global community has gotten together not only to create product development partnerships, but also to create a variety of new innovative financing mechanisms that would help to overcome the market constraints that we discussed. And one such effort has been called the Advance Market Commitment, or AMC, for vaccines. An advance market commitment is a financing mechanism that aims to encourage investment in the development and manufacturing of vaccines that can be sold at affordable prices in low-income countries. The AMC that exists was devised in 2005. It was further refined over the period 2006 to 2009. And then it started in 2009. It's housed at the Gavi Alliance, what used to be called the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. And it was initially funded by a group of high-income countries focusing on a pneumococcal vaccine. In a way, the AMC can best be thought of as a fund that will make financing available to vaccine manufacturers if they're able, under certain circumstances, to create the number of vaccines needed by an agreed time to be sold at an agreed price. This is meant to convince them that there really is a market and that there's really money to pay for these vaccines if they will only be able to make them available. The manufacturers are pre-certified as technically competent. They ensure that there are a number of manufacturers, so no manufacturer can have a monopoly on the production of the vaccine. And they agree in advance on the prices that will be paid for the vaccine. The advanced market commitment was projected to save over 500,000 lives by 2015 and over 1.5 million lives by 2020. The Gavi Alliance had pledged to contribute $1.3 billion to this effort through 2015, with the hope of making the vaccine available to nearly 60 different countries. So it's important to understand that science and technology have played and continue to play an enormously important role in public health and global health. Innovations in drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines have dramatically altered our ability to fight some health conditions. And yet we also know that global markets don't work effectively or efficiently to produce some of the drugs, diagnostics, vaccines, or delivery devices that we need to meet a number of the critical health conditions that continue to plague people in low and middle-income countries. Thus, the global community has gotten together and developed a range of efforts like the Grand Challenges, product development partnerships, and innovative financing mechanisms to try to change the way in which the market works and to try to enable the development of needed products. The next session will be our last one, and we'll speak about the key global health challenges that we're likely to face in the next decade.